Sometimes, a story doesn't begin with a birth. It begins with a loss. In the frozen silence of Wyoming, a widowed man lives alone with his old German shepherd. Until one morning, the dog digs up something buried deep beneath the barn floor. Inside, he finds a letter from his late wife, written years ago, leading him on a journey that will change everything he thought he knew about love, faith, and miracles. But what he discovers in the end isn't just a message from her. It's a message from God. Stay with us till the end. This story will break your heart, then show you how it heals. And if you believe that love never dies, please subscribe, share, and leave A in the comments. Because your faith keeps stories like this alive. Thank you for watching, and may God bless you, wherever you are tonight. Sheridan, Wyoming, sat under a sky the color of pewter. The kind of winter sky that pressed low and made a person tuck their chin into their collar. The wind came straight off the Bighorn Mountains, carrying hard ice crystals that hissed against windows and made the cottonwoods creak like old boats. On the north edge of town, past a mile of fence lines stitched with snow rime, stood a weather-beaten farmhouse where a man named Thomas Hale lived alone with a German shepherd who had learned the rhythms of his grief. Thomas was 58, broad-shouldered in a way that had softened but not surrendered. Years of ranch work had built a frame of corded forearms and a back that still lifted feed sacks like it meant something, and years of loss had etched fine parentheses around his gray-blue eyes. His jaw was square, his cheekbones high under weather-spotted skin, a salt-pepper stubble kept close more out of habit than vanity, and his hair, once black, was now a close-cropped iron that showed a widow's peak like a small confession. Strangers would have said he looked stern, but the people who knew him, fewer each year, would have said he spoke gently, like a man trying not to startle a bird in his own chest. He moved through the kitchen the way men move in a house that used to belong to two people, keeping to the same paths Anna had walked when she hummed along to the radio, skirting the spot by the window where the winter sun used to stroke her shoulders. He set the kettle on, turned the flame down low, and paused with one hand on the chipped blue mug that still bore a faint lipstick crescent that no scrubbing had chased away, because he'd learned that some stains were the shape of blessing. Ranger lay on the braided rug by the mudroom door, a 12-year-old German shepherd with a sable coat that had gone frost-pale around the muzzle. His left hind leg carried a faint hitch from an old tendon strain, and one ear had a notch from a barbed wire scrape, but the eyes were undimmed, deep amber, steady, the kind that checked on you every few minutes the way a lighthouse checks the dark. He was long-backed, square-chested, and moved with the dignified caution of the elderly who know both the map and the cliff's edge. He'd learned to open the mudroom latch with his paw. Anna had laughed the day he did it the first time, clapping her flour-dusted hands, and now he nosed it softly as if asking permission to remember. Thomas poured black tea and stood by the sink where the view cut south, across a shelter belt of Russian olives to the pasture. Wind sent the snow into skeins that ran like lace, and somewhere under the drifted loam lay the roots of lavender that Anna had planted in a grid he never got quite right when he weeded. Anna Hale had been 56 when the illness came fast as a squall. A woman with walnut-brown hair always pulled into a loose bun that frayed by noon, skin the color of warm milk with the faintest sun-made freckles, tall and willow-slim in old jeans and a cinnamon sweater, and a laugh that made people in line at the feed store turn because they wanted to be where that sound was. She'd been the kind of person who learned the names of cashiers' grandkids and remembered who liked pecan pie, a mercy collector in a hard country. And when she died after the second round of chemo, Thomas discovered how a quiet house could be louder than thunder. He kept himself decent by tending to small things. He oiled the hinges that squealed, stacked the wood with the ends out like Anna liked, and drove to town twice a week for eggs, and to pretend he needed new screws at Whitcomb Hardware. Sarah Whitcomb, 66, ran the place now that her brother's hips had gone bad. She was tall and spare in a wool vest, silver hair braided into a crown, a quick smile that made crow's feet accordion at the corners of eyes the color of blue sage. People said Sarah had a clean way of saying hard truths, and that she could tell you which brand of fencing staples you needed by the way you described your soil. When she spoke to Thomas, she did so softly, as if the air around him might crack. That afternoon, as he stood at the counter buying nails he didn't need, Sarah asked gently, "You keeping warm out there, Tom?" He nodded, half a smile. "Tryin'. Ranger keeps the place alive." She looked out the window toward his truck, where the old dog waited, fogging the glass. "Looks like he's keeping an eye on you more than you on him," she said. Thomas chuckled, the sound short but real. On the drive home, the wind lifted again, pulling snow into small whirlwinds that chased the road. Ranger leaned forward on the seat, nose twitching toward the horizon. When they reached the farmhouse, dusk had already blued the hills. Thomas lit the lantern in the front window, the way Anna used to do whenever he was late, and stood a moment watching the glow from outside. The wind calmed, and for a heartbeat the world seemed to hold its breath. Ranger trotted to the porch and sat facing west, ears pricked. Thomas followed his gaze. Nothing moved but the line of cottonwoods bowing in the dying light. And yet, in that stillness, Thomas felt something stir. Not quite memory, not quite presence. Just a soft pull in the chest, as if the house itself was trying to whisper back to him. He reached down, resting his hand on Ranger's head. The dog leaned into it, slow and sure. Thomas exhaled and said quietly, "We're still here, old boy." The kettle whistled inside. And in that simple sound, the first sound of warmth returning, began the faint echo of something neither of them could name yet. The start of remembering. The next morning broke pale and brittle. Sunlight glancing off a world turned to glass. Frost had rimmed every fence post, and even the air seemed to crack when Thomas opened the door. Ranger padded out ahead of him, leaving neat prints across the hard crust of snow. The wind had dropped, but the cold had a clean bite to it, the kind that woke old aches in his shoulder and reminded him how many winters he'd already survived. Thomas pulled on his canvas coat, the same one Anna used to patch when the elbows gave way, and carried the feed bucket toward the barn. It was an old red structure, paint long surrendered to weather, the wood silvered like bone. Inside, the smell of hay and dust greeted him, that dry sweetness that clings to every rancher's memory. Ranger circled once, nose twitching, tail held low in that calm, working dog rhythm. Thomas checked the feed bins, the tack wall, the old workbench under the loft stairs. Everything in its place, same as always. Then Ranger let out a low rumble, not alarm, but curiosity, and padded toward the back corner near the feed barrels. Thomas followed, squinting in the dim light. The shepherd's paw scraped against a board that gave a hollow sound. Thomas frowned, set down the bucket, and knelt. A thin layer of straw covered a loose plank. He pried it up with a screwdriver, and beneath it was a small wooden box wrapped in a faded floral handkerchief. For a long moment, he just stared, heart thudding slow and deliberate, as if afraid to disturb something sacred. The box wasn't large, maybe 12 inches across, made of cedar gone soft with age, the brass hinges dulled green. He brushed away the dust, and a faint smell of lavender rose from it. That scent Anna loved, the same she had grown behind the house. He remembered her there, knees in the dirt, sunlight on her hair, saying how lavender made even sorrow smell clean. Hands shaking slightly, Thomas carried the box to the workbench. Ranger sat beside him, eyes steady. When he lifted the lid, the hinges groaned softly, like something exhaling after years of holding its breath. Inside lay a few small items: a pressed sprig of lavender tied with twine, a snapshot of the two of them from 20 years ago, standing by the truck with Ranger as a young pup between them, and beneath that, a folded piece of paper bound with blue ribbon. His name was written on the outside in Anna's handwriting, round and looping, steady even in her last months. Thomas. He sat down on the stool, elbows braced on his knees, and stared at it for a long while. Then finally, he untied the ribbon and unfolded the note. The first lines were simple. "If you are reading this, then Ranger must have found it for you. I hid this box here because I knew someday you'd come looking for something you couldn't name." He blinked, the words blurring for a second. Anna's voice came back in the cadence of her sentences, calm, deliberate, full of grace. He read on. "Thomas, I worried that when I was gone, you'd stop living and start only surviving. Promise me you won't turn the world into a museum of what we lost. There's still beauty left, in Ranger's eyes, in the smell of fresh hay, in the first thaw. You'll know when it's time to open this again. Until then, let the wind carry me where it needs to." By the time he finished, the barn was utterly silent. He could hear his own breathing, the faint creak of the rafters, the quiet weight of snow sliding off the roof. Ranger rested his head on Thomas's knee, a soft whine escaping him, as if he understood. Thomas reached down and stroked the dog's fur, his thumb tracing the scar on the shepherd's ear. "I guess she was right," he murmured. "You always did know more than I did." The light coming through the barn window shifted then, gold seeping through the cracks, and a few motes of dust spun lazily in the beam. It looked like the air itself had remembered how to glow. Thomas closed the box gently, tied the ribbon again, and held it against his chest. Something inside him, a knot wound tight since the day of her funeral, loosened, just a fraction, enough to draw a fuller breath. He stood, tucking the box under one arm, and turned toward the open door. Outside, Ranger bounded ahead, breaking into a slow trot toward the pasture. The sun had begun to melt the frost off the fences. Water dripped in silver threads. Thomas followed, his boots crunching in rhythm with Ranger's paws. At the edge of the field, the wind carried the faintest scent of lavender, impossible in winter, yet there it was. Thomas smiled, small and private. "All right, Anna," he said softly. "I hear you." And for the first time in years, he didn't dread the day ahead. The day after finding the box, the world outside the farmhouse softened under a fragile thaw. Snowmelt trickled from the eaves in slow drops, ticking against the tin bucket below like a metronome counting time that had once stopped. Thomas sat at the kitchen table with the cedar box open beside him, the letter folded neatly at his elbow, the smell of lavender faint but persistent. He had read Anna's words again that morning, and again after lunch, each time discovering something new, not in the ink, but in what lived between the lines. There was one sentence he couldn't shake. "You'll know when it's time to open this again." He wondered what she meant. The note felt less like an ending and more like a beginning, as if she had planted a clue inside his grief. Ranger lay stretched out by the hearth, one paw twitching in sleep, muzzle resting on his tail. Thomas watched him, then looked out the window toward the barn. The same wind that had once scattered Anna's hair now moved through the pasture grass, whispering softly. He pushed the chair back and stood, the decision already made before he understood it. He gathered the small items from the box, the photo, the lavender sprig, the note, and slipped them into his coat pocket. Ranger perked up immediately, ears rotating forward. "Yeah, come on then," Thomas said with a faint grin. "You're not missing this." They drove west, down the gravel road that followed the creek. The mountains in the distance glowed faintly pink where the snow caught the afternoon sun. After 5 miles, Thomas turned toward a side road that led to the old Miller homestead, abandoned since the 90s. It had been Anna's favorite place to paint wildflowers before her illness. He remembered driving her there in spring, her laughter carried on the wind, brush tucked behind her ear like a secret. He parked the truck beside the sagging fence. Ranger jumped out, sniffing the air. Thomas followed, boots crunching over brittle grass. The cabin stood half collapsed, one window broken, ivy curled through the sill. But there was something almost peaceful about the ruin, as if time itself had grown gentle. Inside, the light fell in golden stripes through the roof gaps. Dust motes drifted like ash in still air. Thomas set the box on an overturned crate and looked around. He imagined Anna sitting by the window, watercolor tin open, her eyes squinting at the horizon. Ranger padded toward the corner and barked once, short, sharp. Thomas turned and saw a small metal tin wedged behind a beam. He crouched, pried it loose, and wiped the rust from its lid. Inside was a folded letter wrapped in parchment and sealed with a pressed sprig of dried lavender. His breath caught. The handwriting on the front was hers again. For when he learns to live again. For a long time he couldn't open it. His hands trembled slightly, not from cold, but from the unbearable weight of memory. Ranger sat beside him, pressing his flank against Thomas's knee as if lending strength. Finally, he broke the seal. The paper unfolded with a sigh. Anna's words, though faded, were steady. "My love, I know grief will make you build walls stronger than any barn. But when the world begins to sound alive again, when Ranger barks not out of habit but because he hears something new, go to the place where you first promised me forever. I've left something there for you. Not treasure, not gold, but a reminder of who we were when the world was kind. Take Ranger with you. He'll remember what I mean." Thomas lowered the letter slowly. The place where he had proposed, that would be the old Cottonwood Hill by the river bend, 3 miles south of their farm. They had picnicked there one spring day when the air smelled of wild clover, and she'd said yes through tears and laughter. He folded the note carefully and slipped it back inside the tin. The light outside had deepened to amber. For the first time in years, the thought of going there didn't feel like pain. It felt like permission. "Guess we're taking a walk tomorrow," he said quietly. Ranger's tail thumped twice, slow and sure. Thomas smiled. When he stepped outside, the sky was washed in rose and silver, and the air smelled faintly of thawing earth. He turned toward home, the box tucked under one arm, and the dog trotting beside him, 2 silhouettes moving through the twilight toward something that finally felt like hope. Morning came quiet and silver, with a thin mist drifting above the pastures. The air smelled faintly of thawing soil and something older, the kind of scent that lingers when winter finally begins to let go. Thomas filled a thermos with coffee, slipped both letters into his coat pocket, and looked down at Ranger, who was already waiting by the door. The dog's eyes were bright, the kind of brightness that comes before goodbyes, though Thomas didn't know that yet. "Come on, boy," he said softly. "Let's go find her hill." They set out just after dawn. The path wound south along the creek, frozen in places but singing beneath its ice. Frost rimed the sagebrush, and the cottonwoods stood bare against a pale blue sky that promised sunlight, but not warmth. Thomas's boots left deep prints in the soft ground, and Ranger's paws padded beside him in perfect rhythm. Two travelers moving toward memory. As they walked, Thomas spoke more than he had in months. He talked about little things, how Sarah Whitcomb had asked about him last week, how the barn roof still needed patching, how he'd thought about repainting the kitchen cabinets like Anna had wanted. Ranger tilted his head as though listening, tail swaying gently. When they reached the old bridge by Miller Creek, Thomas stopped to catch his breath. He leaned against the railing, looking down at the slow water glinting between sheets of ice. It reminded him of the day he'd proposed, sunlight rippling through the same stream, Anna's laughter bouncing across the current. He could almost hear it now, faint as wind through grass. After another mile, the hill came into view, a long rise crowned by a single massive cottonwood, its branches twisted and strong. He'd planted a small bench there years ago, the wood now gray and splintered. He hadn't been back since her funeral. They climbed slowly, Ranger staying close at his side. At the top, the land opened wide, the river below gleaming like a silver ribbon, the mountains ghost blue beyond. Thomas sat on the bench, breath steaming in the cold. He pulled the second letter from his pocket, the one marked, "For when he learns to live again." He read it aloud, voice trembling but steady. "Do you remember, Thomas, the sound the wind made here? You said it sounded like wings. Maybe that's what love is, something that keeps circling back, even when it looks like it's gone." His eyes blurred. He paused, swallowed, continued. "If you're reading this, it means you found your way back. Don't stay in the past too long. Let it warm you, not chain you. And when Ranger is ready, let him rest. He's been waiting for you to heal." Thomas looked down. Ranger lay at his feet, eyes half closed, head resting on his paws. The dog's chest rose and fell slowly, rhythm steady but faint. "Hey, easy there," Thomas murmured, sliding to the ground beside him. He stroked the coarse fur, feeling the life pulsing under it. Fragile, but still there. Ranger blinked up at him, tail giving one last small thump. For a moment, the air seemed to still completely. The wind in the branches hushed. A single leaf, left over from autumn, trembled loose and spiraled down between them. Thomas pressed his forehead to the shepherd's head. "Good boy," he whispered. "You did it. You brought me back." When the stillness came, it was gentle. No struggle, no sound, just peace settling like snowfall. Ranger's body grew still, but the warmth lingered a while longer, as if the soul hadn't quite left yet. Thomas stayed there, one hand on the dog's fur, tears slipping silently into the soil. After a time, the clouds parted. A single shaft of sunlight broke through, catching the lavender sprig that Thomas had carried from the box. He planted it beside the cottonwood, pressing the earth around it with his bare hands. Then he placed Ranger's collar beside it, a circle of leather and brass, worn smooth from years of loyalty. He sat back, breathing the cold air deep. The river murmured below. Somewhere far off, a meadowlark began to sing. First one note, then another, weaving light into sound. Thomas listened, eyes closed. It felt like Anna's voice had found him again, through the wind, through the world, through everything that had once been lost. When he rose to leave, he touched the tree once, palm flat against its rough bark. "Thank you," he said quietly. To her, to him, to the years they had all survived together. As he walked down the hill alone, the lavender behind him caught the sunlight, and for an instant, the air shimmered purple and gold, like a soul finally at rest. Spring arrived quietly that year, not in a rush of color, but in soft gestures. The slow dripping of meltwater from the barn roof, the first green shoots pushing through the frost, the sound of river ice breaking apart somewhere beyond the fields. Thomas woke each morning before sunrise, out of habit, and for a few moments still expected to hear Ranger's nails tapping across the floorboards. But the silence that followed wasn't painful anymore. It had changed shape, become something gentler, a space that felt like memory instead of loss. He had buried Ranger under the old cottonwood on the hill, next to the sprig of lavender he'd planted. Each time he walked that way, he'd find small paw prints in the soft mud. Coyote, sometimes fox, and he liked to think that maybe, in some way, Ranger had company out there. The collar still hung by the door, polished clean and gleaming in the morning light. Thomas couldn't bring himself to move it. Not yet. The farm began to wake with the season. He repaired the fence line, cleared the gutters, and patched the barn roof that had been waiting since last fall. Neighbors stopped by again, something they hadn't done much since Anna's passing. One afternoon, Sarah Whitcomb drove up in her dusty blue pickup, carrying a basket of biscuits and 2 thermoses of coffee. She stepped out, her braid catching the sun like silver thread. "You finally fixed that roof," she said, smiling. "Didn't think I'd live to see the day." Thomas chuckled softly, brushing sawdust from his sleeve. "I didn't think I would either." They sat on the porch together, the smell of biscuits and thawing earth between them. Sarah poured coffee into enamel mugs. Her hands were strong, knuckles marked by work and time. She handed him one and leaned back, watching the light change over the pasture. "I heard about Ranger," she said after a while, voice quiet but steady. Thomas nodded. "He was with me till the end. He found me again, Sarah. Maybe that's what he was waiting for." She looked at him then, really looked, and saw that the weight around his eyes had lightened. There was still sadness there, but it had turned into something softer, almost luminous. "You know," she said, "Anna used to bring pies to the feed store every spring. Peach, usually. You should come by next week. Folks still talk about her." Thomas smiled. "Maybe I will." That night, after Sarah left, Thomas walked out to the barn with a lantern. The place felt different now. Not empty, just quiet in the right way. He opened the old cedar box one more time. The letters were folded neatly inside, along with the lavender that had dried to a fragile gray. He placed one more thing in it, a photograph he'd taken that morning of the cottonwood hill, the sunlight catching the new green on the branches. Then he closed the lid and whispered, "We're home now." Outside, the night was clear. The stars hung low and sharp, the kind you only get in early spring before the heat blurs them. Thomas leaned against the porch railing, listening. The creek was running again, and somewhere far off, a meadowlark called, the same song he'd heard on the hill. For the first time in years, He let himself smile without forcing it. Over the next weeks, he began small changes. He painted the kitchen cabinets the pale blue Anna had always wanted. He reopened the back window that had stuck for years. He even planted new lavender behind the house, one row for her and one for Ranger. Sarah stopped by more often, sometimes bringing soup, sometimes bringing nothing at all but her company. They didn't talk about grief anymore. They talked about spring and fences and the smell of rain on warm dust. One evening in late May, as the sun dipped low, Thomas walked out to the pasture. The air shimmered gold and green. A breeze ran through the lavender rows, and for a heartbeat, the scent was so vivid it felt like Anna had just walked past him. He closed his eyes and whispered, "Thank you." The wind answered softly, curling around him and carrying the smell of lavender up toward the mountains. When he opened his eyes, he felt something he hadn't in years. Not peace exactly, but belonging. He realized the house was no longer a museum of what he'd lost. It was a home again. And as twilight settled, Thomas Hale, widower, rancher, survivor, finally stepped inside, ready not just to remember, but to live. Sometimes, God doesn't speak in thunder or miracles. Sometimes, He whispers through the wind that passes a lavender field, through the loyalty of an old dog who never stopped waiting, or through the heart of a lonely man who learns to love again. Thomas's story reminds us that healing doesn't always arrive in grand moments. Sometimes it's in the quiet sunrise, a friend's smile, or a memory that refuses to fade because love never truly dies. If you've ever lost someone you loved, if you've ever felt alone but still believed there's meaning in every breath, then maybe this story is your reminder too. God's miracles often wear the face of ordinary life. May God bless you, and may He walk beside you in every silent moment that feels too heavy to bear. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave your thoughts in the comments. Tell us who you're remembering tonight. And don't forget to subscribe, so together, we can keep sharing stories of faith, love, and second chances. May the Lord bless and protect every soul watching, now and always.